73 through 89. I'm doing this by propositions. Of course, as I mentioned, and to go back, I want to recap just a little bit. To go back, the preface was written afterwards, after Napoleon, the world historical spirit on horseback, enters Jena, where Hegel was teaching at that time, and had completed the Phenomenology. Hegel wrote the preface afterwards. So it was a retrospective account of the preface. Is that Phil?
Phil's here, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that was a retro. Slot?
Phil. Yeah, gotcha.
Okay. So this was retrospective, and in a way, the interesting thing about this, I think Hegel opens up the prospective reading strategy. It's, I think, very important to understand what he's doing. And again, if the preface opens up the movement of the dialectic, in such a way that we went over, in some detail. We'll go back over that after we finish, kind of at the end. We'll do the retrospective after we finish with the prospective part of this. So a preface, once again, literally in Latin, the praefectati, is the same beforehand, right? It is the same beforehand. It's supposed to announce the project of the book. In my version of this, and once again, I want to just put out some tendencies in Hegelian dialectical thinking and by radical Hegelians. Jean Hippolyte says, forget the preface and begin with the introduction, because that's the introduction to the science of knowing. Okay? On the other side of that, our friend Stanley Aronowitz thinks that the preface contains everything in the phenomenology and the movement of the dialectic. So there's a question about how things are interpenetrating and interrelated. I don't think Stanley's the only one. There are a lot of people who do take the preface very seriously as something to be studied as a kind of key for the text itself and the movement. So, in one way, I mean, this is very suggestible. So, I'm suggesting here very much that one could take the preface as a reading strategy for the whole book, and you look at each section and go back to the preface, right, in terms of central propositions, especially the way of doing philosophy that he talks about. And we mentioned this as well. Doing philosophy requires an estrangement, requires defamiliarization. And I want to put these words up here because Marx certainly uses it in different capacities in philosophical and economic and philosophical manuscripts. But I think this is very important to keep in mind. Defamiliarization, which became a code, if you will, and a strategy in the Russian formalist readings of texts, particularly around Boris Eichenbaum and Viktor Slavsky in the 1920s. And then, of course, estrangement, the Entfremdung, which could be also considered partially, movement towards alienation, right? So we begin to have these hints of these moments that play out in Marx, maybe in much more of a material way, but this is very important for the understanding of the unfolding of the, quote, world historical spirit, okay? So, anyway, so the introduction is more about the Wissenschaften, right? The science of knowing, or what that means, and that's not like we do science, right? It's a very, very strong, strenger, way of doing science. The Wissenschaft, right? The craft of knowing, really, and that strong tendency. And again, the preface, movement, I would say you begin to pick up on the movement of the dialectic. And in other crucial terms there, multiple things. Why philosophy? What is philosophy? what is a totality? Totality and truth, that relationship is going on throughout, and what, these propositions that are essentially thought through both by the scholastics, the left interpreters, right, in many ways. Lukács, of course, is going to think through the totality and truth through his reading of the concept of the totality in History and Class Consciousness, for those of you that have read Reification and Class Consciousness of the Proletariat. I mean, this is obviously crucial to Lukács. For Adorno, there's no such thing as a full totality, there's only partial totalities, right, in a way. And this became part of the debate in postmodernism to think through that there's no such thing as a full totality, only the pars totalitas.
This is something that you brought up,
Partial whole.
from Adorno's book on dialectics a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
I was reading that today,
please,
actually.
Yeah.
And I had the same question because if I thought maybe you could explain it to me.
Yeah, maybe.
If we don't have a full totality, then how can we conceive of the contradiction, the parts? Because isn't it necessary to have the parts mediated through the whole, and then back to the parts again to have the full understanding?
For Adorno, it's not this full circular movement that allows you to ultimately have the whole totality. I mean, the whole totality.
So he changes Hegel's dialectic.
Yes, he does. It's a dialectic that does not resolve or move to the resolution of contradictions. I would say, in Adorno's case, and this is, I think, one of his attractions for today, to my mind, as well as Jean-François Lyotard, who started this in terms of the postmodern moment, is that we do not have the ability right now, right, to see all the levels of the contradictions, right, that are playing out, and we cannot get to the principle ultimately of a fully resolved contradictions at this point. We're only looking at parts and then moving in a sense.
So it's sort of a shift to a process rather than kind of the completion of a program.
Yes. I mean, even though Hegel, again, is emphasizing process completely through this. This is really what we're doing. We're going from this description, again, I was going to do a little more of the outline, but I mean, it's a a very good question here related to the principle of contradiction. The dialectic basically has three essential parts, and people forget this because they always want to talk about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? The triad, right? The positing, the anti-positing, and then the coming together, the synthetic. Really, in Greek, literally means to come together. The interesting thing about Foucault and others is they begin to critique what is the synthetic ground, right, itself. How is the synthesis done? In Derrida, the question was always, where did theory become justified? How did it become legitimated? So this is a very interesting moment in the history of this kind of post-structuralist encounter with the Hegelian system, right? As well as with the Marxist system too, in a way.
So does Marx make that shift too, could you say? Or does he say that there is no full totality, Marx?
Well, he never engages in just kind of pure philosophical discourse.
But could you say that of Marx? Maybe?
Well, the totality for Marx is in the introduction to the political economy. You get the best sense of the critique of political economy in the introduction that's in the Grundrisse, in which there are the four moments that are all interrelated, which is, as you know, production, the mode of production, the mode of consumption, the mode of distribution, and then the mode of exchange. And these four things are always in relationships to each other, etc. Listen, the thing here is to think of this more relationally than the fixity,
on the whole.
I mean, of the whole, right? This is, I think the way to kind of comprehend it, at least for this level, right, where we are right now. So again, our problem right now is, the problem, it seems to me, is that we're at a point where the contradictions are so obvious, right, at one level, but we can't put our fingers in terms of You know, what is the social totality about all these things? You know,
Right.
on the one hand, you know, we have, you know, Space Force being exchanged in the defense budget for something else in the Senate. Now, what's this contradiction about? I mean, obviously we know capital has to expand and space is the next frontier. We know this. We know the financial of nature is the next stop, right? So we have two levels now in financialization. Outer space, right? And nature here, right? So we have this relationship going on right now between the literal universe, right? And you know, nature itself on the planet and how it's being financialized. So to the Marxists, how do you engage this, right? In terms of a totality, to think through what are those contradictions at a certain point. I mean, we know it's an extension of capitalist logic, that once you run out of ground to conquer, you want to go somewhere else. I mean, it fits in terms of the will to power of the capitalist class, that they're going to expand to outer space, you know, Trump's Space Force, right? I mean, this is like, you know, Marvel Comics at work. But at the same time, as we know, big bucks are going to go into this, and, you know, this is part of the, I mean, I want to read the new defense budget, you know, you can access that stuff to see how much money's actually going to be devoted here.
$750 billion.
Yeah, but that's the whole budget, yeah. No, not the Space Force. Yeah, part of Space Force, well, yeah. It's part of the totality of the budget, or the whole budget, so to speak. Yeah. The totality means when all the involvements come together.
Yeah.
This is really the thing, where all the investments, if you will, the investitures are all coming together. You know, in a certain way where there's movement, and you're able to see this as a sphere that's unfolding into another sphere that opens up, you know, that a contradiction has been resolved, right, at that level.
Yeah.
So to read Hegel, you're always thinking again circularly, right? This is why I'm doing this. You know, you go back to the beginning, which is really the end, the preface, right? The result is here, as well as the beginning, right? In the preface. And we're going to go full circle to revealed religion. I mean, we won't spend a whole lot of time on that. We'll talk about that historically, if it has any relevance for today. But you know, certainly what we're tracing here, instead of the history of matter, or the history of the dialectic of nature only, you know, in terms of it as a material force, we're really moving now as we go into, well, I mean, let me just say this.
Yeah,
you know,
sorry.
as you know, no, it's okay. No, it's all right. It's good. It's good. You know, we go from here to A. You know, the first part is really consciousness. That's the book. The book begins with consciousness. Now, this is consciousness in general, right? A, right? And we're talking about natural consciousness. Okay? We're talking about natural consciousness, right? And as you remember, the first part is sense-certainty. Now, this is not self-sense-certainty. This is self-certainty in general as it's related to natural consciousness. We're not yet even close to anything. And I'm going to just put this as central things to help your reading, maybe. I mean, I hope it does. Proposition 109 is a crucial part of the section on sense-certainty. I went over this pretty carefully. Yeah. And this also can be, you know, compared to section 207 later, right? When he goes through the question of skepticism, or not only the question of skepticism, really the historical shape of consciousness called skepticism. So you begin to see relationships here between the truth of self-certainty and, you know, as the forward movement, as he will go on to, you know, look, what's really going in here is the notion of the truth of sense-certainty that emerges then in the historical shape of skepticism. I mean, I hope this helps. I mean, I'm trying to think this through in the sense of, what's related to what in the text itself, and how we can think this in a very active way. So 109, the notion, right, of self-certainty, and this is a very crucial point about self-certainty and its dialectic, right? Then we begin to see in 207 and 202, the notion playing out into the historical shape of consciousness called skepticism, that movement. So you begin to see what the skeptics are about, and the skeptical attitude and the skeptical consciousness. Now, historically, the skeptics, of course, were the radical skeptics of the 17th century, of which Descartes becomes one of for a while, and we have two types of doubt in Descartes. We spoke a little bit about this. I think it was in Arto last
Bruno, I think we
Bruno,
talked about
that's
Descartes.
right. We did on the method of doubt.
Yeah.
Right, that's right, because he put Descartes as the third category there. Yeah, but he had guiding questions. Right. So the notion here was hyper-skepticism, hyperbolic doubt. Right. The skeptic itself is always in that doubtful attitude. Right.
Yeah.
Not a negation, but doubtful. Right. This is another thing too. Okay. So this is the first part, and then after one, sense certainty, which is, as you remember, propositions 90 through 110, right? The second part is perception, and in perception, right, we begin to see, and this is 111 till 131. Propositions 130, 20 propositions, right, in which Hegel advances in 130 that perception, and this is very interesting too, is a kind of sophistry. Right? And when we read Rimbaud, maybe we'll see some of this at work too. So there's a backing to the sophist tradition as well, right? Back to Plato, back to Aristotle, etc. That we'll talk more about that as we go on. But anyway, I want you to realize this is a kind of sophistry, and of course, in this context, Rimbaud, as a poet, used to call Madame Sophistry. As the wit of his period, the one who could argue anything, right? So the sophists is great at, the sophists, as were itinerant philosophers who would give rhetorical lessons in the names of politics to the wealthy families in ancient Greece, right? And this was the dialectic and dialogue that Socrates had his whole life. Right? And it was really the sophists. They were the main antagonisms and sometimes friend. So you have multiple Platonic dialogues about this. Again, the history of philosophy, very important to Hegel because he's absorbed it all. He's interiorized it in such a way that he's able to put this out. But in the Platonic dialogues, the Meno, the Gorgias are the main, dialogues on sophistry. And of course Aristotle's sophistical refutations, which is part of his logic of the organon. Okay, so perception then or the thing deceived, right? So Hegel's clever because he'll use a language like the thing itself is being deceived, right? In terms of perception, you can do both. Deceive the object and the thing itself, right? As well as, play with it as it's the truth to natural consciousness. So he's also saying this, how this sophistry works, right? And he's playing that out in that section. Okay, so anyway, so then we go on to the, after perception, right? We go to consciousness, and this was number 3, was force and understanding. And this is where he begins to talk about duplicity and reduplication, which becomes very important in the reading for today. Force and understanding, appearance, right, and the supersensible world. And I'll just leave this up. Kraft und Verstand, I looked at Verstand und I looked at the German on this and it's correct. So this is 132 through 165. And again, you know, force as a movement and force as unique, right, together, right? And we have this notion of the unconditioned universal. Okay. The unconditioned universal, which is both equally in its own self, what it is for another, and then it also contains the difference in its own self. Mm-hmm. So it's being for another and being for self together, right? This is the unconditioned universal. Very important to remember because we're going to set up a triad, universal, particular, and singular. This is the great Hegelian moment, and you know, our friend Bruno will talk about the singular, you know, which is the third aspect. And a great essay on this, of course, is concluding the unscientific postscript by Kierkegaard, you know, in which the truth of subjectivity is thrown out, a reaction, kind of religious, but in a way very interesting and very smart.
Concluding unscientific what?
Concluding unscientific postscript.
Postscript.
Yeah.
Concluding.
Yeah, unconcluding.
Unconcluding.
Unconcluding, yeah. Unconcluding scientific postscript. Right.
Okay.
Or concluding unscientific, I'm sorry, concluding unscientific, my mind, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. You said that.
Playing on Hegel, yeah. He's playing on Hegel, because Hegel considered the system science, right? Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we have, and I didn't really speak much to this, and maybe I should do this next term, the relationship of Spinoza to Hegel in this chapter with force. Conatos, and Mia's not here tonight, but we can talk about conatos and the will to power. So I'm going to put that as an aside in a parenthetical way. You know, we have conatos, which is the force of self-preservation in Spinoza, basically our will to live in a way, right? But you know, as you know, Hegel we'll talk about this later, it's just not the will to live or the preservation of the will to live, right? And we'll talk about this in terms of also the will to power. So the Spinoza-Nietzsche moment will be
Same group. Okay, there's no issue.
Yeah.
what happened?
She's lining up in the same group.
Okay, yeah. All right, so anyway, that's an aside, a parenthetical remark to go back to Spinoza's conatos, right, and the will to power. We'll talk about Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Hegel. So I'll just put that up here, so we'll have it on. I mean, we have both projects here, obviously. And in a way, it's interesting because, you know, for certain people, myself included, you know, Hegel can play out as the great systematizer and, you know, the system philosopher of whom both Spinoza, in terms of his ethics as a system, and you know, provides this kind of subterranean philosophy, and Nietzsche also provides another kind of subterranean philosophy. So you begin to see these early encounters, right, against the system, against system builders, in a way. Even though Nietzsche called Spinoza the highest form of philosophical vampirism. Right. Nietzsche has quite the tongue, to put it mildly. Yeah. Anyway. All right, so we'll go back. Then proposition, 136 is force, etc. 153, the law of motion. He begins to talk about that, and that's the beginning of the section on Newton. I'm just highlighting these things if you want to, reread or relook at it, since we're going to have multiple days without Hegel. And 165. Behind the curtain, he actually uses the word, right? He uses behind the so-called curtain, the metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Interesting.
And this is going alongside of appearance, right? Which is appearance in the supersensible world, right? The logic of appearance is happening here. Again, think of this as the description and the encounter and the movement of natural consciousness. We're not at the level of self-consciousness.
Right.
There's no self here. Right? Okay? This has not happened yet. So, from consciousness, in terms of sense certainty in general, perception or the thing deceived, and also, force and understanding, the law of appearance and the supersensible world. Right. So you have the law of motion, and then behind the curtain, the metaphor of behind the curtain. Right? And he points to the requirement in terms of movement, going back to the proposition 153 on the law of motion. He goes back to we need a more complex movement, right? Yeah, in a way. So in some senses, this is the encounter with Newton and Spinoza in this chapter as figures of thought. Newton's laws of gravity, right? And the mechanics, right, of that period, as well as, probably a philosophical encounter with force in the Spinoza sense of Knechtschaft, right? So you have those two things, unique force, proper force, and then force as a reduplication. We begin to see these reduplicated moments, this doubling that's going on, right? In that sense, okay? So that brings us up, and again, I want you to remember, once again, that this is basically all about what he calls natural consciousness, right? This is what we're doing here, and basically I remember I set this up as I won't go back over that, but set this up as reading a philosophical novel as well, as a kind of odyssey, a different way of reading it. So this is a kind of, descriptive, if you will, hyphen, somewhat analytical framework that we could work with in terms of an outline. And I hope this helps, these kind of crucial, sections. This goes all the way to 165, and this is where he ends with the supersensitive appearance, right? This is where we end in that section before we go to consciousness, and self-consciousness. Okay? So let's go there. I'm going to erase this. Okay?
Yeah.
Have it? Everybody? It's enough? Okay. I can see them coming in tomorrow. Or also. Okay, so
Progress right here, right? Stupid.
what's that? I'm sorry?
These stupid whiteboards.
Yeah, it's unbelievably bad, right? Let me just see if this eraser is better.
Need some water or something.
Yeah, you're right.
I think there is water over there.
Yeah, it's a little smoother. But yeah, we can get water afterwards, yeah. Okay, all right. So, now we're in the second part, part B, right? If you divide, we're really in the second part of the first part, okay? Of the first chapter, right? This is basically the movement to self-consciousness. So, B is self-consciousness. So the first part of the book, the first half of the book, if you will, is divided into two parts. Consciousness, truth of self-certainty, perception of the thing deceived, I know I'm repeating myself, but important, and also the notion of force and understanding, right? And the appearance of the supra-sensible world, right? The second part, B, is about self-consciousness, and this is going on from 166 to 230, and begins with, for the truth of self-certainty. Now, to highlight this again, 167 defines self-consciousness as desire in general. And I want us to keep that in mind throughout this. I'll wait until next time. I was going to do something on my tongue and Hegel, but I'll wait today. Right? Desire. Right? Self-consciousness is desire in general. Right? Double object. One is immediate. Object. That is of natural consciousness or of sense certainty, perception, etc. And these have, for self-consciousness, a negative. The character of a negative. Please keep that in mind. This is not positive, right? The character of a negative, right? Okay? So that's the first object, right? Which is immediate, which has to do with the objects of natural consciousness, which we just went through, right? And which have for self-consciousness, right? Which this second part of the first, half of the phenomenology is in touch with self-consciousness, a negative, it has the character of a negative, right? Okay? The second object is basically the true essence. So you can see the doubling, right? After the negative, right? You're going to begin to see the negative, right? Is present in the first instance, but it's always opposed, right? There's an opposition that's going on here. So we begin to see the opposition to the natural consciousness in the second moment. Do you understand this? And so we're going through, right? In terms of this journey, desire in general is self-consciousness, right? There are two objects at work in this in proposition 167, right? Mm-hmm. That is the natural consciousness being described, sense certainty, perception, force and understanding, the laws of appearance, which have the character of a negative. What begins to oppose this is the essence, right? That the true essence of what's really going on. Right. The truth of sense certainty. Okay? This is happening. So the object, as we go to 168, becomes life. Life itself, Leben. This is how we get to consciousness and life, right? Okay? Proposition 168. So this kind of opens the chapter, right, on self-consciousness. Okay, so then we have and look, I'm going to do this. I mean, I'm sorry to do this, but I think it will help again. You begin to see this at work in propositions. I'm doing some comparisons here. I hate to be very scholastic here, but 309 to 346 in a chapter we have not read or encountered yet. But this is where Hegel begins to show, right, relationship to immediate objects and actuality, and the study is through phrenology and physiognomy, the sciences of his day. The physiological and the phrenology, and most of you know phrenology is the study of brain size. And there was tremendous racism about this in this period. I recommend a great book. It's very funny, but it's very serious. Sandra Gilman's book called Difference in Pathology, in which you begin to see skull types and how this was used, in terms of medical practice and of course in racial configurations that still go on till today in terms of at least metaphorics and some white supremacist movements. Right? So anyway, anyway, I wanted to point that out to you as well. This is going to go on in section 5 and in reason, right, when we get there. But anyway, I wanted to say that. Okay, so self-consciousness, you have 3 moments, right? And this is, again, and let me go to the text. I think this is proposition, yeah. You have the 3 moments, yes. 176, right? 176, you begin to see the 3 moments of self-consciousness.
Right.
So again, what I'm trying to do here, both conceptual, how the notion is transformed, the logic of the opposition, as well as the temporality, right? So the 3 moments, first is the mere undifferentiated I.
Right.
Right? The I that is aware of objects. When you say I am conscious or I am aware, you're in the first moment, right, of self-consciousness for Hegel. I am aware that LIU is a horrible place to work. That's one moment of self-consciousness, the first moment. Or I am aware that the defense budget is, $786 billion, probably with $50 billion, in a slush fund to go into space, to Space Force. Anyway, you can play with that as much as you want, right? But it really is about awareness and being conscious of something, awareness, right? 2 is when the object, right, becomes the object of desire or of appetition. Of appetite is more Hegel's language. So you have that one, and then where the object the appetition, right? Or becomes the object of appetition, the object of desire. Put this in filmic terms. I don't know if you ever saw the Louis Buñuel film, That Obscure Object of Desire, but in that film you may see the second moment, as exemplified in film. You seen the film? Yeah, many years ago? Yeah, it's a great film where you have the 2 women, the 2 characters. No. He had, Maria Schneider was cast. There's an interesting backstory on this. Maria Schneider was to be cast in the role of the one woman, but she was going crazy and supposedly was in the south of France and all of this. He liked her performance. Or I think in Last Tango or something.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So anyway, he wanted to cast her in the role. So then he said she went, nuts. And, she had tendencies, according to a lot of people. But anyway, I don't know. But anyway, so Jean-Claude Crécadière, his scriptwriter and a good friend of Buñuel's, said, why don't I just create 2 women? We'll do different types. One will be a kind of, a tall Anglican-looking woman, and the other will be a Latina, right? And these will be the dual objects of desire to Fernando Rey's character in the film, right? So he had this dual object at work, and of course it was the object of appetition. So the double is really playing out here in the Buñuel film, right? The 2 desires, the primitive, if you will, I'm using that term like, or the more primordial sexuality or visible versus that of the more, quote, civilized type. Right? Which is interesting. I know it's stereotypes, but he played out that type very well, right?
Oh, he played with stereotypes constantly.
Yes.
Who were the two women who?
I forgot the actress's name, yeah, but one was very Anglican looking, you know, kind of like a Charlotte Rampling type.
That's possible.
And yeah, I don't think she played the role, but it looked like.
Well, she would be the type.
Yeah, she would be the type, and then the other one was more like, who played Salma Hayek, you know, that,
Oh, yeah,
like that, you know.
Earthy.
Right, much more earthy. So you had earth and civilization, nature, you know, civilization playing out there in certain ways. Kind of interesting in terms of the symbols. Anyway, the idea there is, the certainty of the object of appetition, right? Yeah, and the dual. I mean, I just use that as an example, you know, where you can see that, you know, because it's in the title, that obscure object of desire. The object of desire, since again, you know, the double object, right? Right? As it says certainty, maybe the dark-haired, right, etc. And then the other one, you know, the second object in terms of the true essence of civilization, right? In some ways, moving back and forth. Right? Okay. So anyway, kind of simplistic, but to a degree, maybe an example worth looking at deeper. Okay. Then the third moment is in, and this is crucial, relations to others. Right? And this is where, and I think, Josh, you pointed out last week, the I-we relation, right? This is where the I and the we start to have the relation, right? Right? So, yeah, again, right? These are the three moments. And this is the beginning, if you will, of intersubjective, right, relations. Right? And we're going to see this later in, of course, the Lordship and Bondage, you know, chapter. This will be going on. Okay? So, for self-consciousness to be meaningful, it has to be both the subject and object of its own concept. So when we talk about, you know, something like Hegelian subjectivity, I think that what happens here is that you have to think about the concept of subjectivity, right? And you see the subject-object together, right? Yeah, right. So it's simultaneously that movement that is going on. Consciousness is experiencing itself on the threshold, right, of realizing, right, that where the unity of differentiation begins to take place. Okay, each for each other, right, for himself, and then only does the threshold, and what we're going to look for here, we're going to look at the threshold into the I, into the we, and only when we get to spirit does this happen. Right? Only with spirit. Right? Yeah. Becoming spirit. Right? And this is where Hegel is going to go. That's why this is really where the phenomenology begins. Right? In self-consciousness.
Right.
In this I-we relationship. Okay? Does that help? That's the marks of beginning, right, of what's going on, right? Only in spirit does it overcome. And remember at the beginning of the semester I mentioned that some people, including Fred Jameson, are translated Geist now as community.
Right.
So this could be interesting too, right? Okay? So what we have here is we have this movement again, going back to A, remember, is natural consciousness, just for our purposes, right? Consciousness in general, but let's call it natural consciousness, right? A, 1, 2, 3, sense, certainty, perception, force, and understanding. We begin to see how things appear to us. We look at that through presuppositions, right? We try to see what the presuppositions are, and we try to move them away, right? This is what's going on in the first, 165 propositions, right? Now we are getting into the birth of the self, right? The birth of self-consciousness, right? And this is very essential, first of all, that the motivation behind this in the beginning was desire, right? In the beginning for Hegel, desire in general is what's moving this, and there's this double object always happening in the beginning, right? In a sense. So he will be reading later here the Lord's desire, the bondsman, the slave's desire, right, etc., the master-slave dialectic, and how that dialectic works, right? As well as we're going to make the transition later, we're not going to get there tonight, to reason, right? That's where the next threshold is. So this is a kind of, if you will, crucial chapter in my view, certainly Coget's view, right? And certainly other, commentators who privilege this master-slave dialectic, right? Hegel and Haiti, Susan Buck-Morss, who reads this as Toussaint, educated by the French, right? Through all these things, turns this against them, right? Ultimately uses that in the slave uprising in 1791. And then she claims that obviously Hegel was very aware of this and also is, kind of coding, if you will, this historical event. To me, it's a kind of reductionist, historicist reading, but at the same time, it has a lot of force to it.
So that's
it's
when
good to be aware.
Phenomenology was written, though?
Phenomenology was written in 1807. 1791 was the Santo Domingo slave uprising. Napoleon, as you know, has an order to kill Toussaint in jail in 1803, I think, if I'm not mistaken. In 1803. Yeah. Right.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense.
And Hegel, well, Hegel would reply to you, Josh, you're still in common sense. You have not been defamiliarized enough. You have not been, estranged enough to see this at the conceptual level. But anyway, but Hegel is really taken in 1807 by the emperor. The world historical spirit on horseback, Napoleon, and the Napoleonic, reaction.
Yeah, but at the same time, he says that thoughts have to become action.
Yes, that's right.
Maybe he would actually say.
Yes, that's true. So you have really basically here 1789 to 1794 is basically the Jacobin moment, right? If you will, right? For, just as a temporal, marker, right? You have the Jacobin moment. Not the newspaper today. They're behind this. Right? They're not as conscious.
Yeah, they need to have a different logo, like the guillotine or something.
Yeah. I told you the story that my cousin, who's a judge, inherited a guillotine.
The traveling guillotine.
Did you see the traveling?
Traveling.
That they used to take through the South, Yeah. Can you imagine? This was her husband. It was a man. Obviously a madman. We're calling me up. Do you know anywhere? I said, Xavier, we need it for the revolution. Traveling guillotine. I can see Peter rolling it right? So anyway, so you have this in 1791, as you know, is the Santo Domingo slave uprising, right? I forgot the actual date that Napoleon takes power, but you of course have the reaction, Robespierre's guillotine, Saint-Just, all the leaders, right? Robespierre has Danton guillotine, it's a mess, right? To put it mildly, right? But anyway, after this, the Napoleonic movement starts, and so Hegel, who's is very radical in his youth, the tree of liberty that he plants with his friend Schelling and Hölderlin, with both Hölderlin and Schelling, seems to kind of come back around to try to understand the world historical spirit through the figure of Napoleon, right? And this is also going on behind the scenes here. Okay? So remember, we're always dealing with, two essential unfoldings here. The unfolding of the absolute spirit, world historical spirit, in Hegel, and this will start to go on at the end of this section, self-consciousness, right? We're going to begin to see this in the next section with reason and spirit, side by side. And then we're also looking at the historical unfolding, if you will, of absolute knowing. These are the two spheres that are going side by side. Historical world spirit, if you want, the other one being that of, the knowing.
So,
So to go back to the introduction, right? Yeah, as well. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm having a hard time putting this question together, but
Yeah,
if we don't have spirit, like we're going back to Adorno, for instance, or with Marx, I think, probably too, like if we don't have world historical spirit, if everything we don't achieve this level of spirit, then we don't have this level of self-consciousness, ultimately. So what is it that, or how do they, how would they pose self-consciousness without that, without that organic whole as spirit, ultimately?
I'm sorry, I don't get the whole gist of the question.
Yeah.
The spirit of, like, the proletariat is a class for itself.
Yeah, I mean, Marx basically invents the proletariat. I mean, the proletariat didn't go around calling itself the proletariat.
Right.
Marx develops a concept, right?
Okay.
As well as, based on the world historical spirit unfolding, before him. He begins to see this. This is where they begin to see, through the level of.
Okay, so in some terms, he
the
does
Manchester,
maintain spirit.
the satanic mills, right? The cotton trade, right? He said when he begins to see this as early as 25, the wood theft in his youth, that he wrote about. This is him observing, if you will, or on the threshold of, going through not only self-consciousness, but making a move to say this world historical spirit, and seeing it, and what it is. I mean, if you say just world historical matter, you have to kind of say, well, what are we really talking about there?
Exactly.
I mean, the question of spirit is very important because with spirit, Hegel also, we're going to talk about this as well, there's the concept of freedom.
Right.
Right? Right? So we have to keep this word in mind. I mean, look, again, it's very pale compared to the English spirit and what but when you say someone's spirited, right, or the spirit is really moving, right, etc.,
Right.
or someone's putting that spirit into something, you're talking about activity. You're talking about a kind of activity. I don't know if you want to put it in the category of materialistic inspiration, or it's materialistic unfolding of communities at large. How does this work? But, again, he's building the system, right?
Right.
So, So, anyway, but we'll come back to that.
I think I get it.
So, anyway, for Hegel, the overcoming is going to take place here.
Yeah.
We supersede by this.
Right.
Yeah. If you want to go back to the first three, sections in section A, the three part, the sense certainty, etc. That could be part of knowledge, whereas the spirit is the overcoming, the supersession of this into the we self, right? And we is necessary for reason. So he's going through this again, step by step, right? Step by step.
Okay.
I mean, now listen. Maybe this will help. Let's look at A as the science of the experience of consciousness, right? It's the science of the experience of consciousness. Second part, beginning here, transitional moment into the second half of the book, which is the phenomenology of spirit. And that's why I emphasize this, because really then you begin to do the phenomenology of the overcoming, the supersession. Right? Okay? Does that help a little bit?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So you have on the one hand, the science of the experience of consciousness in the beginning, right? And that morphs, if you will, into the second part of the book, second half of the book, into the phenomenology of spirit.
Spirit, yeah.
You're beginning to do a phenomenology now, right? Yeah. The appearance of world historical spirit, but its dialectical movement,
Right.
which will take the form of reason, again, spirit, he has a chapter if you looked at the whole book, and then of course revealed religion at the end.
Right.
And you have three spheres that ultimately address this. Art,
Right.
religion, and philosophy are the three major spheres that are unfolding, of which philosophy and the science of knowing, becomes the absolute.
Right.
Okay? So again, we're so accustomed to think relativity in relative terms, and we're so accustomed to think in this kind of positivism that really we forget Hegel's dealing with absolutes here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. From idea, notion, concept, to absolute knowing and absolute spirit. And a lot of religious people pick this up. And have used it, but that's one wing of the Hegelian tradition, right, in some ways. Yeah. I mean, you could change absolute, which literally means to liquidate, right, into, reconciliation or reconciliation of concepts. Of contradictions.
Right.
As they unfold in history. But going back to the contradictions, you have formal contradictions, which is part of formal logic, and the is and the is not becomes part of that, those kind of questions of metaphysics, right? You have, of course, the pragmatic contradiction, what you have to do, and then, of course, you have the rational contradiction, too. And, so he's working within this rational, within this moment. Now, he's trying to get to the reasonable here, and then, of course, to action.
Right.
And you could read this as, I'm just throwing this out. You could read again part 1, if you will, which ends with this chapter, right? To part, the history of natural consciousness, the history of the relationship of nature to mind in general, right? And then the shift is really to the self, to the spirit. This is really what's going on. So you can read it that way. Read the first part as formal contradictions that are being unfolded in some ways, right? And then ultimately we get into the pragmatic and the reasonable. The pragmatic transition may be the master-slave dialectic and what self-consciousness is about. Yeah. So anyway, maybe we should go there too. So, yeah. So we're in the master-slave dialectic. 177, right after the moments, is, and I'll read this out loud. This is before we get into independence and dependence of self-consciousness, lordship and bondage. 177 is self-consciousness exists for self-consciousness. Only so is it in fact self-consciousness. For only in this way does the unity of itself and its otherness become explicit for it. The I, which is the object of its notion, is in fact not object. The object of desire, however, is only independent, for it is the universal, indestructible substance, the fluid, self-identical essence. A self-consciousness, in being an object, is just as much I as object. And Josh, when I used to talk to you about I as an object, he's going through this here, in many ways, right? With this, we already have before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousness, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I that is we, and we that is I. It is in self-consciousness, in the notion of spirit, that consciousness finds its turning point, where it leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now, And the night-like, this is a very nice metaphor, and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond, right? And steps into the spiritual daylight of the present. Okay? For Nietzsche will write the dawn, right? In Twilight of the Idols, yeah. So this is interesting because this becomes the transition, if you will, into the master-slave dialectic, right? Which is the next one, next section, right? So we have the concept of self, which is the next moment, right? This requires reduplication, other selves. Very, very important to keep in mind. Requires reduplication, doubling. Okay? And opposing selves, right? And a relationship always implies the opposition. The Hegelian self must produce itself by its own activity. So going back to what you were saying earlier about process and work, if you will, this is where it's going to begin, right? So only in a community of selves is self-consciousness possible. So self-consciousness presupposes a community, a Geist, if you will, in that sense, a we, before self-consciousness can exist. You can't just be an isolated, solipsistic, entity or whatever, because you're going to be a solipsistic consciousness, not a self-consciousness. Right. The self requires doubling, requires relationships with others. A very good book on this. I mean, again, a very good philosophical study. I mean, it's technical, but it's good. One Self is Another by Paul Ricoeur. The book we read on Freud. One Self is Another. It's a very solid work on this kind of activity. So, the consciousness of self is the consciousness of being free, and free is independence. It's okay. Happy holiday if we don't see you. Yeah, maybe tomorrow night we'll see you. We're going to go for a meal. Arto's coming tomorrow night, if you want.
Here.
And we're going to go to dinner. Here.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll be
I'm
here.
sorry.
No problem. Don't worry. No worries. Yeah. It's good to see people have lives other than Hegel. Right? Yeah. Anyway. All right. So anyway, to go back, again, do you understand that what's being presupposed here, again, is the community of selves, right, in this section, right? And then we're going to go into the processes of acknowledgement or recognition. This is absolutely crucial, right? Yeah, as we go forward. Okay, so now we're at the level of recognition, the drive, and the fight for prestige. 178 to 191, not 196. So we go from self-consciousness, right? So this propositions, the first moment in 178 is the drive for recognition and prestige. And self-consciousness, some of the highlights of this section is 186, being for self. Self-consciousness is, to begin with, simple being for itself, self-equal through the exclusion from itself of everything else. For its essence, an absolute object is I, and in this immediacy or in this mere being of its being for self, it is an individual. What is other for it is unessential, negatively characterized object. But the other is also a self-consciousness. So this is the beginning of, if you will, the shapes of consciousness and the rooting out of all immediate being, right? This stuff begins to root out all of immediate being. This is 186, right? Yeah, and it's a very important section for understanding, because you're rooting out all of the absolute abstraction, all immediate being merely the purely negative being of self-identical consciousness. In other words, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self, or as self-consciousness. Again, for me, if you want to make a note, if you ever want to follow up on this, concrete relations with others and Sartre's being in nothingness is a very, very important chapter in this history. You know, the fleshing out of what Heidegger would call the Mid-Sein, the being with. You know, yeah. So you can see here, in a sense, that the drive for recognition, right, the drive for prestige, the desire for this thing, is in Heidegger becomes the being with others, a different kind of intersubjectivity, right? So you begin to start seeing some differences at work here between the two of the three H's, the other one, of course, being Husserl. yeah, the three H's, right? Okay, so anyway, that's an important section, and the rooting out, so I would read that very carefully too, and right, mutuality 184, I didn't put that up, but yeah, okay, so what we have now is 189 begins the Lordship and Bondage section, really. It's about pure self-consciousness. The Lord, 190, is the consciousness that exists for itself, but no longer merely the notion of such consciousness. Rather, it is a consciousness existing for itself, which is mediated with itself through another consciousness, through a consciousness whose nature it is to be bound up with an existence that is independent or thinghood in general. The Lord puts himself into relation in both of these moments to the thing as such, the object of desire, and to the consciousness for which the thinghood is the essential characteristic. And since he is, as the notion of self-consciousness, an immediate relation of being for self, but also is now at the same time mediation. So think of the Lordship always as not only being for self, right, in that kind of activity, but also as mediation. Okay, so you have this play of mediate forces and play of mediation, right? Related both to both and mediately to each other. Mediately to the bondsman through a being, a thing that is independent, for it is just this which holds the bondsman in bondage. It is his chain from which he could not break free in the struggle, thus proving himself to be dependent, to possess his independence and thinghood, but the Lord is the power over this thing, for he proved in the struggle that it is something merely negative, since he is the power over this thing, and again is the power over the other bondsman. It follows he holds the other in subjection. Equally, the Lord relates himself mediately to the thing through the bondsman. The bondsman, as self-consciousness in general, also relates himself negatively to the thing and takes away its independence. But at the same time, the thing is independent vis-a-vis the bondsman. And you know, you can see where Marx gets labor and the labor theory. Right here. Right here is really the connection. Right? The bondsman whose negating of it therefore cannot go, and this is a section on work, right? To the part of annihilation. In other words, he only works on it, on the thing. For the Lord, on the other hand, the immediate relation becomes through this mediation, the sheer negation of the thing, or, quote, the enjoyment of it. Right?
Yeah.
Okay? So this is very interesting, you know, the way he does this, and you begin to see, especially in the humanist Marx, the early Marx, 1844, especially, you know, how much this influenced him. Propositions 190 and 191 in the Master Slave Dialogue. Okay? So in both of these moments, right, The Lord achieves his recognition, 191, through another consciousness, for in them the other consciousness is expressly something unessential, both by its working on the thing and its dependence on its specific existence. In neither case can it be Lord over the being of the thing and achieve absolute negation. This section 191 is about inequality, basically. You basically see the whole structure of inequality here in recognition, both in recognition and in economic activity. This is 191 at work. The outcome is a recognition that is one-sided and unequal. You know, you begin to see right here the notion of unequal exchange among human beings, the structure of inequality, etc. Okay? So, the truth of the independent consciousness, and this is what Hegel is very good at doing, is positioning to the exterior where that truth is of this consciousness, right, is in the servile consciousness of the bondsman. The master does not exist without the servility of the other consciousness. Again, going back to the logic of opposition, you know, in the dialectic. Yeah? Right? In terms of standing opposed. Right? And in a way, this is class relation, this is stand. You know, the relationships of the stands, you know, and standings in the German, right, regards. So anyway, boy, this is for a short person here, these tests. Anyway, really short. Yeah, anyway, okay. Then he goes on the truth and the for itself. So this is the section that is very, very famous, right? I mean, any questions about it? I mean, the truth of the independent according to the servile consciousness, 193, and then 194 basically talks about what self-consciousness is. You know, the consciousness is not the dissolution of everything stable, merely in principle. He actually brings us about. He rids himself of his attachment. This is the bottom of 194, 117. Rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every single detail and gets rid of it by working on it. So the feeling of absolute power, both in general and in the particular form of service, is only implicitly this dissolution. And although the fear of the Lord is indeed the beginning of wisdom, right? Right? So this is the beginning of wisdom. The slave is wise to interiorize the master, is not therein aware that it is a being for self. Through work, however, again work, the bondsman becomes conscious of what he truly is. In the moment which corresponds to desire in the Lord's consciousness, it did seem that the aspect of unessential relation to the thing fell to the lot of the bondsman, since in that relation the thing retained its independence. Desire has reserved to itself the pure negating of the object, and therefore its unalloyed feeling of self. But that is the reason why this satisfaction is only fleeting, for it lacks the side of objectivity and permanence. Work, on the other hand, is desire held in check. Fleetingness staved off. In other words, work forms and shapes the thing. The negative relation to the object becomes its form and something permanent because it is precisely for the worker that the object has independence. This negative middle term of the formative activity is at the same time the individuality or pure being for self of consciousness, which now, in the work outside of it, acquires an element of permanence. It is in this way that, therefore, that consciousness, as worker, comes to see in the independent being of its object, its own independence. Okay? All right, good. Because this will give you the sense of inventing the proletariat.
Yeah.
Right here. This section. Right?
What section is this?
This is section A, right, of the part B of the book, and this is 195 and 196. Propositions 195, where I'm reading from right here. Yeah, the feeling of absolute power, and then the worker and the negative relation. This is really about the labor of the negative and work, right?
Yeah, and only the bondsman can attain the self-consciousness ultimately through.
Right, that's right. That's where Marx got history takes place, but behind their backs.
Uh-huh.
So again here, and I mean I didn't read this, but part of the issue here, the trial by death, 188. I mean, to me this is very important. The risk, that takes place. Most people just live. That's what he says, and he juxtaposes life against.
But it's also not death.
No, it's not death.
Because
It's
you could fail in taking the risk and die.
Yes.
And nothing is attained.
That's true.
So you need to there needs to be this, co-dependence on life. So both.
Yes,
both
it's both risking life, right, as well as life itself. But as Hegel points out, most people will choose the biological life, right, over that of taking the risk, right, and the risk towards freedom. I'm sorry. Not overly important. So,
well, that's for sure, No one takes the
so
risk.
this is the security principle at work.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say here, when we're writing, Peter, myself, and Bruno are working on a book, called Techniques of Servitude. And one thing we have is what we call a servile index. We're going to try to, include this into something like the F scale of the Frankfurt School. But anyway, all to say, I mean, that's kind of a preview. We got to get this done. but the idea here is that most people, and of course, I see this in union struggles, right? And as part of taking risks all the time, right? That most people, 95%, will not risk. They will take the secure way out. But essentially, the secure way out is not always the best way, right? And in a sense, it may be defeating the interest itself, right?
I also thought that the section on fear was interesting too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You have to be afraid to shake you from the bondage and into.
Exactly. You have to undergo that fear. That's correct. That's correct. You have to be fearful and in a way embrace anxiety. I mean, that seems to be the problem that most people have today, is embracing the anxiety.
And understand where it leads.
Yes, and where it leads.
Yeah.
Exactly. Very good point. Fear in this context, and I'll check the German, I don't think he uses angst, I think he uses fear of something, right? Yeah, and that's very, very important, right? The choice ultimately, look, I want to point this out. I mean, this is important, and probably we should pick up with this for the next session, in January. The choice in Hegel in this section is really between freedom and life, right? Those that choose life, the biological life, and the safe path, right, are not really choosing freedom, right?
Yeah.
This is really the crucial dialectic to me. If you want to think of this, think of this over the holidays. I certainly will be.
Well, and it's interesting in terms of what he defines freedom is.
Right.
In the next section too.
Right.
The freedom to think, ultimately.
Right. Freedom and life. And life is an opposition in some ways, in a dialectical tension to freedom. Free at last is a slogan. May speak to this, at last free to think, right? Free from bondage, right? In a certain way, yeah? So you can think of it that way, as well as other ways of thinking about it, of course.
Right.
But again, it's this risk of life, right? Which Josh correctly points out that it's not death.
Right.
It doesn't have to be actual biological death.
Yeah.
If the risk, because risk does nothing in that context.
Right.
Yeah. And you have to remember, we're going through in absolution and in these spheres, there's vanishing going on.
Mhm.
You're really moving. You're unfolding like celluloid. You know,
Right.
life as film, you know, so to speak, right? In a way. And you know, you go back to the preface. I've seen that movie before,
Right.
right? Something like that. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So any other thing, you know, you have to relinquish selfhood, right? The attitude of the independent consciousness, right, or the independence is to choose freedom over life, right? You relinquish humanity, right? In some cases, you know, people do this for animality. He actually proposes this. Yeah. There's a relinquishment of humanity for animality.
Oh yeah,
To be alive at all costs.
yeah. Right.
Some of the slogans that I came up with. The dependence on the security doctrine. Yeah?
Well, it's interesting too.
The
Like
master always knows that the slave wants to stay alive. Yeah?
yeah.
The boss knows that the worker still wants the job. Think about this. I mean, really in some ways, how this is really working in everyday life. But go ahead, yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just thinking about how it's interesting how most people now have internalized themselves as the master. They only see themselves through the consumption of everything, basically, right? To a degree. Everything exists for their enjoyment if they can attain it. This is sort of the American dream in the sense.
Right, but the problem with that is in the consumer attitude and the consumption and the enjoyment of the object,
Right.
in a sense, is it's not really freedom.
Well, that's what I mean.
That's the whole point.
There-
Because
that's
there's
the-
no risk
The
for your
slave
ability
is
to
actually
take
the
it.
master position ultimately.
Right, that's right. The trust fund baby, it takes no risk.
Right.
Right?
And that really
Those
to attain,
connected from the Ivy schools in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, yeah, but go on. I'm listening.
to attain freedom ultimately is to make ultimately, and that is the
Yes,
work there.
that's right,
ultimately,
that's
that
right.
we don't have, that we seem to have lost in some capacity.
And the engagement with the labor of the negative.
Yeah.
And the negative both being determinate negation here,
Mhm.
as well as the negation of the object as you make it.
Right.
The production, right?
Right.
From the making of the object to the consuming of the object,
Yeah.
and understanding that kind of process. You know, it's good. No, this is first-rate stuff. I mean, this
Yeah.
is very interesting for the day, you know, in terms of this. And, you know, you can think about this also in terms of master discourse and
Yeah.
slave discourse as well. I mean, you know, which was pulled out in the 80s and 90s in terms of readers' strategies, right?
And it's interesting too now, if you think about everybody in America thinks of themselves as a capitalist, even though they're you know, unless you're in charge of a bank or something, you're not a capitalist, you're an employee, a salaried employee, ultimately a slave, you know. So like the American position sort of, you know, puts forward everyone as this master position.
Right, I mean, the
Whenever-
startup, I mean, the whole
Yeah.
thing of the notion of the startup, the entrepreneurial, you know,
Yeah.
which literally in French means to take between,
Yeah.
the mediator in capitalism, you know, entrepreneur, you know, to take between, you know, yeah, to claim between, the betweenness, right?
Mm.
So this is, yeah, absolutely happening in all aspects. And the whole thing of the security principle, look what the French are fighting for, pensions.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, they're fighting for the security of life,
Right.
right?
And then that
They're
goes,
not fighting for a transformative society, they're fighting to protect their,
yeah.
quote, life. This is not about freedom, it's about a fight for, you know.
And that's just straight to one-dimensional man. The
Yes.
subsistence on the
Absolutely.
on
Yes,
stage.
absolutely, and it becomes one-dimensional thinking.
Yeah.
Completely. From man to the thinking to, you know, the alternatives are not really proposed or presupposed in that regard. Yeah, yeah. It's a very important book, One Dimensional Man.
It is,
I
yeah.
think it's more important now than it was when it first came out in some ways. I think it
Yeah.
has much more of the prophetic power, and it has a substantiveness that you can see in a very good, you know, almost in daily life and an empirical example. It's very timely
Yeah.
in that respect. This is One Dimensional Man
Yeah,
by Herbert
Marcuse.
Marcuse. Yeah.
And it goes through the logic also.
Right.
It's also sort of being put to work
Right.
here
Right.
in a sense too.
Right. I want you to remember here, this is really about process. You know, it's always about process in Hegel, right? I mean, it's unfolding of spheres, but anyway. Listen, again, what does the master know? What does the boss know? This is important always to know in any kind of struggle, in any kind of confrontation. And the boss usually knows this is what the worker will take. This is how far the worker will go.
Oh, yeah.
And this has to be confronted. This is what unions have lost sight of, because the unions are about security rather than taking the risk for a transformative, you know, life, etc. So, yeah. Right. So, anyway.
I mean,
The master is always standing still. To go back to what you're talking about, it's like a still life, the master. Just sits there. As consumer, but also needs the recognition by the slave.
It's totally
so that doubling makes him stand still, fixes the master, in a sense. I mean, you know the next thing coming out of Trump's mouth. You know the next thing coming out of the senator's mouth.
Oh, yeah.
This is very totally predictable at this point. You got, you know, Moscow Mitch and Tel Aviv Chuck, you know, going in with each other over the formal rules, huh? Right? Right? Yeah. Interesting, huh? It's a great book.
This
really worth reading and thinking about and going back to. And you know, I mean, I think we're getting a sense, right, of the dialectic, you know, at work. What I'll do, you know, when we get back, I'll do multiple things. I'll, of course, do a resume and a summary. I mean, I'll come back and talk about this. I think it's probably best to leave the historical shapes, skepticism, stoicism, and the unhappy consciousness, maybe as a transition to the next section. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, it's up to you. I can do it, but
no, and we can wait for other people to come back.
Yeah.
It is interesting though to see how, you know, kind of historically in this section in particular, he builds from the Lordship and Bondage to the Stoics to the Skeptics. You have this kind of movement.
Right.
Of uncovering and development that, you know, I guess I hadn't really paid attention to that the first time.
Right, good.
You know,
good.
but
and then, you know, what does he devote most of the space to is Judeo-Christian codes, the unhappy consciousness.
Exactly.
So that'll be interesting to confront, and how does that passage into reason take place? I mean, I'll outline it, but I'll wait till people get back. At least we have an outline general. You know, because in sections 309, I mean, you know, basically reason is a very long chapter. You know, chapter 5, right? I think it's from 309 to 437. Yeah. Okay? And, you know, we're going to see self-consciousness in relationship to the brain size. We're going to see actualization of rational self-consciousness, pleasure and necessity, the heartthrob, the noble soul, right, etc. Then we'll see virtue and the way of the world, which is basically a, you know, what's the Republic of Virtue but the French Republic, right? I mean, you know, it's basically the post-revolutionary. And then the spiritual animal kingdom and the community of animals, because the intellectual becomes part of the community of animals. You know, we can talk about that more. Then the law giving, and then the testing of the laws by Antigone, and then we'll go through ethical action in the section on Geist, on the spirit, right? We'll do that next part. I have the whole thing outlined with crucial sections, but I'll reread. I'll have this with me, you know, obviously during the break. Yeah. What else did you want to say?
No, I mean, if we're gonna stop at this, then we should stop.
Well, no, it's okay.
Because I think.
Where'd you want to go to?
No, I didn't. I mean, I can easily stop here because it's still dense. I spent most of my time actually going through the Stoics this time because I kind of had anticipated that it maybe would work the same way as the previous chapters, where you have this really abstract sense of those sort of rules and, you know, how the rest of the chapter is going to unfold. I don't think it quite did that this time. But.
Well, the interesting thing about the Stoic to keep in mind is he only thinks about freedom but is not free.
Yeah, I mean...
And Epictetus, in terms of his everyday life, you know, the sayings of Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius' slave, which is the beginning of kind of the Stoic tradition and Stoic consciousness. It goes into very elaborate forms, but what they do is they're only thinking about it.
Yeah.
not acting. It's interesting that he puts the Stoic in that thing, right?
I didn't have like a full like historical kind of background to what the Stoics were too, so I tried to look into that a little bit.
Well, look at Epictetus,
Yeah.
the sayings, Enchechedon is his sayings. They're very good. I mean, you know, he's very smart. Yeah, but he was the slave consciousness as Stoic. Yeah. Hegel's very clever here. I mean,
Yeah.
he goes through these. This is a shape, again,
Yeah,
of consciousness. Right?
And it's interesting too how it builds, you know, because this is also kind of a historical development too, where it's a sort of coming together of civilizations in a certain sense, and the, you know, coming from this building from the city-state to something more complex, and then you have this kind of limit to it in the Stoic philosophy ultimately too.
Right. And one thing that we have not talked about yet, and we will next time, is how this unfolds as a kind of philosophy of history.
Yeah.
You know, really what that comes up in, how it becomes part of triumphalist capitalism,
Yeah.
right, in terms of the absolute spirit and absolute knowing, the end of history hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
As well as the attacks on the system and method. I think what I'll do too is I'm going to make myself a note about this.
It seems like too when you get to the Lordship and Bondage, there's a shift. It becomes more like a more social philosophy or something in a sense.
Well, it's self.
Yeah.
It has to be social because it's now self.
Right.
The part here, again, to emphasize again, the first part up until this section, which is very transitional, or really in a way a kind of threshold into the second part. So again, read it this way, like I said earlier, you know, that you're getting the structure of the experience of consciousness, the science of the experience of consciousness, and now you're beginning to get the phenomenology of the spirit as seen through the social totality, and then ultimately the sociality, if you will, of reason.
Right.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it mirrors the way that the chapters are built too. First, you get this sort of abstract logic,
right.
You know, and then you have the unfolding and the sort of social examples.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, so I'm going to do something too, when we get back. I'm going to do the difference between method and system.
Yeah.
For Hegel too. I think this will be a good point to kind of point out.
Because
the
system
of knowing
is the spirit,
versus the methodology.
Okay.
System of knowing and system of spirit unfolding. Yes. Yeah, so we'll do that versus method, dialectical method. Not versus, but alongside, and the distinctions necessary.
Yeah, I think that's important for me.
Yeah.
Because I think, because I keep trying to apply this to Marx. And of course there are different Marx.
I would read him and then I would read Marx,
Yeah.
and I think then you have a really much fleshier, much more substantial Marx, and especially the Marx of 1844, the introduction to the Grundrisse, or what's called the Critique of Political Economy, how he does a critique from the standpoint of the Hegelian totality, what he uses, and then ultimately the logic that Artaud's fixated on, but we'll see what comes of that. I'm not so sure that the lot,
The syllogism and all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's another story. Marx obviously works deductively, in many ways, but again, Marx is creating object domains very much like Hegel is.
Right.
These are object domains. Sense certainty is an object domain, right? Of natural consciousness. Perception is an object domain, right? Yeah. When Merleau-Ponty does the primacy of perception and the phenomenology of perception, he is performing a Hegelian operation here. Right, in a way. He's going back to that, right? For phenomenology, perception is crucial.
Yeah. I mean, it's a completely different approach.
Certainly, yeah. So, okay, all right, we're good. Well, why don't we close up here? And we have certainly tomorrow too, and I'll erase.